All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, one of the central themes of this show is that more important than listening to what politicians say is to watch what they do and who has their ear, who funds their campaigns, whose phone calls do they answer, whose advice do they solicit. So from the beginning of the crisis, it has been corporate CEOs and Wall Street executives who have had their calls answered by Washington, D.C. with predictable results. Never forget that the first congressional action was a paid sick leave bill that had a giant carve-out for large corporations that frankly left much of the American workforce high and dry. And of course, the main bailout included a feast with all the trimmings for the big guys, coupled with a paltry side dish for small businesses and individuals. Predictably, millions of Americans have struggled to access their cash payments and unemployment benefits, while the Small Business Assistance Fund has already run dry. Now, in the latest example of exactly how and on whose behalf business is conducted here, President Trump has announced the members of what they're calling their Great American Economic Revival Industry Groups. Hat tip to Iramiose Frimpong for pointing this out to me. As best we know, the groups are meant to advise the president on when and how to reopen and reignite the economy. And of course, all the great lords and ladies of our economic and financial ruling class are represented. The Agriculture Committee has representatives like Tyson Foods, Cisco, and Purdue. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and Bank of America are on the Banking Committee. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the other leaders of the military-industrial complex found their seats on the Defense Committee. Fossil fuel leaders like Exxon, big food industry players like McDonald's and Coca-Cola, of course, big pharma and the health insurance industry are all well represented. Walmart, Apple, on and on and on. 16 different committees, all stacked full of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and business tycoons, all given an official seat at the table to continue to direct from on high exactly how the economy should continue to be run to inure to their benefit. And out of those 16 committees, exactly one has any representatives of actual working people. A few unions did get a seat at the table on what's called the Construction Labor Workforce Group, where they will work alongside additional industry shills. So while big business is overwhelmingly represented with a say over every aspect of our economy, the workers who actually make our economy run, who are in fact absolutely essential to preventing societal collapse right now, who are risking and contracting coronavirus to keep the shelves stocked and the goods delivered and the buildings sanitized, they're given a few token slots in a ghettoized segment of the task force, grouped together in one place to make it more convenient for them to be ignored. As Irami put it, this happens to black folks all the time, where we get shunted to a diversity committee or something. Meanwhile, the real decisions are made by programming and budget committees. And in exactly the same way, workers and their representatives on whose backs this nation depends every single day, who are hit the hardest on every front in this crisis, whose lives and livelihoods are at stake, are shifted off to the side as if labor is a special separate category rather than an integral part of every damn thing we do every day in this country. It's honestly a perfect emblem of how Washington is run. Token representation for the working class, power and budgetary authority for the wealthy. It's also a perfect emblem of the phony populism of the Trump administration. Sure, they talk a big game about their support with union members while staffing up a National Labor Relations Board with people who've spent their careers helping companies bust unions. They talk a big game about the forgotten people, but then they spend all their political capital enacting Paul Ryan's fantasy tax cut scheme. They bluster about draining the swamp and then staff up with frickin' Gary Cohn, Reince Priebus, and Steve Mnuchin. He promised to end NAFTA and upend our relationship with China, but he only got a modest NAFTA rewrite and not a whole heck of a lot, honestly, out of China after his much-touted trade war. Everything else has been mostly about telling the high and mighty here to piss off and sending them into an endless, recurring series of feigning spells, which I have no doubt is quite satisfying for many to watch, but is ultimately meaningless in terms of the material conditions of their lives. No wage action, no workers' rights, no help with childcare, and an embarrassing failure after adopting GOP orthodoxy on healthcare. With his president of the working man shtick, Trump may have figuratively brought the white working class into the room, but they're sitting off in the corner at a sad side table with no actual power, influence, or respect. And that's the white working class. The black and brown working class don't even get the benefit of rhetorical pandering. Look, we don't really know what these particular committees are going to do, honestly, because as with everything the administration does, it's a muddled, incoherent mess with zero transparency. But it says everything about how they actually see the working class people who helped bring Trump to the White House. Remember, as much as we've rightfully mocked Pelosi for suggesting that SALT cap tax deduction as the next bailout step, Trump has been pretty much completely ideologically absent from the economic bailout debate, aside from immediately ditching any attempts at oversight of that massive corporate bailout. His administration floated a capital gains tax cut for the next stimulus, something that would obviously overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy. Some great populist stuff there. And now as we watch millions file for unemployment and line up in miles-long queues for food distribution, they've got a whole passel of the super elite lined up to make all those big decisions that the poor peasants are too dumb to make or understand. Oh, but it does come with an obligatory pat on the head for labor. I'm sure Steve Mnuchin will closely listen to their recommendations as he's doling out trillions to the wealthy and the politically connected. And I think this is the case that Democrats didn't want and never effectively made against Donald Trump.
Well, how are they supposed to make that case whenever Joe Biden's cabinet is full of Jamie Dimon and...
Well, that's the problem, is that they're complicit.
Yes, yeah.
They operate in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And so they're unable to make a credible case against the true failings, the true ways in which Donald Trump has let down that white working class that was so enthusiastic for him.
You know, it actually highlights something that we've been talking a lot on the show here, which is that power concedes nothing without a challenge and without a real challenge.
Yeah.
And so this is, part of the challenge, I think, for, people who are on the populist left is, look, Trump came into office basically as the sole bearer of like a populist right GOP orthodoxy movement. And then what happened is that the RNC and Paul Ryan and all these other people basically grifted onto the movement and realized that they could use that new power to do everything that they've always wanted to do. I guarantee you he probably doesn't even know anything about NLRB or who was being appointed. The people who made that decision are all people who would have worked in a Mitt Romney administration or who are probably on Jeb Bush's campaign staff. It's a central failing of the Trump administration is that there are fundamental contradictions in how the man conducts himself personally and how the office itself has been run. And a lot of it comes down to a lack of understanding of how the political process works. Like with healthcare, he's like, we're going to have great healthcare. Trump doesn't know a whole lot about the healthcare system and outsourced it because here's the other thing. The GOP had been talking a big game for 7 years, saying we're going to defund, repeal, and replace Obamacare. So he's like, wow, you guys have it ready to go.
Let's do it.
Then it actually came time to repeal and replace Obamacare. Nothing. They had no idea what they were doing. So in order to push and make sure that you mold an administration in the view and hold it accountable, you have to have actual elements within the party who are able to hold out and credibly call out this type of behavior when you see it. And there's just not enough. Well, that's the truth.
And here's the reality is both parties are essentially captured by varying wealthy interest groups.
Yeah.
The Republicans tend to be more beholden to like fossil fuel interests and, they have their own Wall Streeters.
I think Megan Day said this.
Yeah, and Democrats are like Silicon Valley.
Hollywood.
And then, in Hollywood, and they also have their own Wall Street contingent. And it's a lot of it comes back to the way that you have to fund your campaigns. And also it comes back to like the social set that they want to see themselves in. I don't think we should underestimate that part of the pull. And so when you have both parties captured by wealthy elites, what you fight over in terms of the working class is basically cultural issues, right? They get sort of rhetorical pandering. They get some tokenism, right? The white working class gets to watch Trump like sticking it to the frickin' media that looks down at them with contempt, which I have no doubt is like legitimately a satisfying and enjoyable thing to watch. But that's it. That's ultimately it. Then on the other hand, you're getting, the biggest initiative of the whole administration. The only thing they've really been able to get their act together to do was this massive tax cut that has led many more multinationals to pay literal zero in taxes with a few crumbs thrown to everybody else, disproportionately benefiting the wealthy, disproportionately continuing the direction that the economy was already going in. And even the China thing. I mean, ultimately the sort of detente that they came to didn't really come with a lot of wins in terms of American people.
That's the only thing which I'll push back on.
And even before this crisis, like we covered here, manufacturing was in a recession. So the idea was going to bring back the jobs in terms of the factories and manufacturing just hasn't happened.
So manufacturing has been in recession, and that's complicated for many reasons. And I think actually much more because of lack of government investment than just the trade war with China. But in terms of China, I do not believe any president would have done what Trump did. And I think he needs the credit for, I mean, we're talking about $500 billion, basically the entire international commerce between the United States and China that was smacked with tariffs. And even in terms of the deal, the phase one deal, there's still $250 billion worth of tariffs on China. I believe that this country would be even more screwed in this coronavirus crisis than it already is if that trade war had not been happening for 3 years. I think it is in the history books, it is what we will remember him for forever. And look, I'm not saying it's like the best thing.
I agree with you.
He broke from China.
Yeah,
the first president to ever actually do it.
That is true, and I support. I mean, from the beginning, I said, I diverged from sort of Democratic Party orthodoxy on this. I know you'd be surprised to hear that. I'm normally such a good Democrat.
Yeah.
But what did he ultimately get for it? Not a lot. I mean, that's
phase
the
one
reality.
was not great, but phase two is still, I mean, there's still hundreds of billions worth of goods that have a lot of tariffs on them. And look, I mean, I have a lot of trust in Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro. I've spoken to both of them extensively, interviewed them on my podcast and stuff. And like, in terms of the things that they got in the phase one deal and on phase two, these are these are not Wall Street deals. These are actual deals that actually help workers and have real snapback punishment provisions, which have not existed in an American trade deal in a long, long time. But look, I mean, the broader point that you're making, I think, is correct, which is that overall it has not been the worker paradise that was promised, right? Like, it was not the Steve Bannon presidency of which fueled Trump to the office. And this is the problem.
Because if you're going to do that, you have to be totally 100% committed. And his ideology, like in certain areas, is firm. In other areas, like you say, he doesn't really know. He sort of outsources the healthcare. And so when you do that in this town, you end up with the same elites controlling everything. And you end up with like these, American industry councils or whatever the heck they're calling them, overwhelmingly stacked with, Wall Street, Walmart, Silicon Valley, all the like lords and ladies of finance and business with a few little tokenist seats there for workers that, they're not going to be listened to. It's going to be, and from the beginning of this crisis, that's who has been brought into town for advice, who's been on the phone, giving the president advice, giving the Democrats advice. Remember Richie Neal we were talking about when he was first people he called was Hank Paulson and Bob Rubin. So that's the reality of how things run here, and that's the reality of how things still run here under Donald Trump.
It certainly is, and it is. If he loses, it'll be because of dynamics like this. I've said it here from the very beginning.
Next up on Rising, small business loan programs have already run dry. Big shocker there. Tax changes in the coronavirus relief package benefit millionaires. Economics reporter for the Washington Post, Jeffrey Stein, he's been all over all of these developments. He's going to break down his reporting on the state of the economy when Rising continues.